6 months. That's how long it took him to realize he'd been sleeping with 2 different women. His wife Sarah and her twin sister Emma had orchestrated the perfect deception, switching places whenever it suited them. By the time he discovered the truth, he'd already fallen in love with the wrong sister. What he did next would destroy both of them. David Chen was a creature of habit. At 35, he'd built a comfortable life as a software engineer at a tech firm in Austin, Texas. He worked predictable hours, came home to the same woman every night, and followed the same routines that had defined his 8-year marriage to Sarah. Consistency was something he valued, perhaps even craved, which made it all the more disturbing when he realized his wife had become inconsistent in ways he couldn't explain. It started with small things, little discrepancies that David initially dismissed as stress or distraction. One evening in early January, Sarah came home and didn't recognize the new coffee maker he'd purchased the week before. She stared at it like she'd never seen it in her life, asking when they'd gotten it. David had laughed it off, assuming she'd simply forgotten in the chaos of her busy schedule as a marketing manager. Then there were the food preferences. Sarah had always loved spicy food, the hotter the better. She'd drag him to Thai restaurants and order dishes that made his eyes water. But one week in February, she ordered mild chicken at their usual spot and complained that the dish was too spicy when it arrived. David had looked at her strangely, but she'd just shrugged and said her stomach had been sensitive lately. The perfume was another thing. Sarah wore the same scent every day, a floral fragrance she'd worn since before they met. It was part of her identity, as recognizable as her laugh. But sometimes, maybe once or twice a week, she'd smell different. Vanilla instead of jasmine, citrus instead of rose. When David mentioned it, she'd look confused and insist she was wearing the same perfume she always did. Her handwriting changed too. David noticed it when she left notes around the house. Sometimes the loops in her letters were round and flowing, other times they were sharp and angular. He'd picked up 2 different grocery lists from different days and couldn't believe they'd been written by the same person. When he brought it up, Sarah had laughed and said handwriting varied depending on mood and how rushed she was. But the thing that really got to David, the thing that kept him awake at night, was the way she looked at him. Some days, Sarah would gaze at him with the familiar warmth of 8 years together. Other days, she'd look at him like she was seeing him for the first time, with a strange mixture of curiosity and something he couldn't quite identify. Guilt, maybe, or fear. David tried to rationalize it all. Marriage was long and complex. People changed. Stress did weird things to memory and behavior. Sarah had been working longer hours lately, dealing with a demanding client that kept her at the office until late. Of course, she'd be distracted. Of course, she'd forget things. But then came the night in March that changed everything. They'd been intimate that evening, nothing unusual about it. Afterwards, as they lay in bed, David had traced his fingers along Sarah's back the way he always did. It was a habit from their early dating days, a gesture of affection that had become routine. His fingers moved across her shoulder blade, expecting to feel the small crescent-shaped scar she'd had since childhood. Sarah had told him the story on their 3rd date. She'd fallen off her bicycle when she was 9, landed on a piece of broken glass, and needed 12 stitches. But that night, his fingers found nothing. Smooth, unblemished skin where the scar should have been. David froze. His hand stopped moving. He pressed his fingers against the spot, searching, certain he was touching the wrong area. But no, he knew Sarah's body. He'd touched that scar thousands of times. It was always there, a small imperfection that he'd come to associate with her. The woman next to him shifted, asking if something was wrong. David pulled his hand back and told her everything was fine. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he'd just discovered. Or rather, what he hadn't discovered. He didn't sleep that night. He lay there in the darkness, listening to the woman beside him breathe, and tried to piece together an impossible puzzle. The inconsistencies, the memory gaps, the changing preferences. And now this. The missing scar. There was only one explanation, and it was so absurd that David almost laughed. But the more he thought about it, the more it made a sick kind of sense. Sarah had an identical twin sister named Emma. David had met Emma a handful of times over the years. She lived in Denver, worked as a freelance graphic designer, and maintained a distant relationship with Sarah. The twins had never been particularly close, at least that's what Sarah had always told him. Emma rarely visited, maybe once every year or two for holidays or special occasions. She'd been at their wedding 8 years ago, standing as Sarah's maid of honor, and David remembered being struck by how identical they were. Same face, same height, same voice. The only way to tell them apart was that Emma had a small birthmark on her right wrist that Sarah didn't have, and Sarah had the scar on her shoulder blade, but Emma didn't. David's stomach churned as the implications hit him. If the woman he'd been with tonight didn't have the scar, then she wasn't Sarah. She was Emma, which meant Emma had been in his house, in his bed, pretending to be his wife. David spent the next day in a fog. He went through the motions at work, barely able to concentrate on the code in front of him. His mind kept circling back to the same impossible question. How could Sarah's twin sister be impersonating her without him noticing? And more importantly, why would Sarah allow it? Unless Sarah was in on it. Unless they'd planned this together. The thought made him feel sick, but it was the only explanation that made sense. The twins were switching places, taking turns being his wife. That's why Sarah's behavior had been so inconsistent. It wasn't one woman acting strangely, it was two different women pretending to be the same person. That evening, David came home to find Sarah in the kitchen, preparing dinner. She smiled when she saw him, asking about his day in that familiar voice he'd heard for 8 years. David studied her face, looking for any sign of deception. But she looked like Sarah. She sounded like Sarah. She moved like Sarah. David walked up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her close. He nuzzled against her neck, then slowly moved his hand up to her shoulder blade. His fingers found the scar immediately. Relief flooded through him, so intense it almost made him dizzy. This was Sarah, his actual wife, but the relief was short-lived, quickly replaced by a different kind of dread. If this was Sarah, then who had been in his bed last night? The woman without the scar. Emma. David pulled back and asked Sarah a casual question about where Emma was these days. Sarah said her sister was still in Denver as far as she knew. They hadn't talked in a few weeks. David nodded, keeping his expression neutral, but inside his mind was screaming. Sarah was lying. She had to be. There was no way Emma could be switching places with her without Sarah's knowledge and cooperation. Over the next week, David became obsessed with figuring out the truth. He started documenting everything. He set up a hidden camera in their bedroom, disguised as a smoke detector. He installed tracking software on Sarah's phone when she was in the shower. He checked their credit card statements and bank accounts, looking for any unusual transactions. What he found confirmed his worst fears. There were plane tickets, multiple round-trip flights between Austin and Denver over the past 6 months, all booked in Emma's name. Hotel stays in Austin that overlapped with times when David had been home with who he thought was Sarah. Text messages between the twins, carefully encrypted but not carefully enough to escape David's software engineering skills. The messages were damning. Sarah and Emma had been planning this for months, coordinating their switches down to the smallest detail. They'd swap places every few days, sometimes for just a night, other times for nearly a week. Emma would fly in, Sarah would brief her on recent events and conversations, and they'd trade places seamlessly. But why? That was the question David couldn't answer. The messages were full of logistics, but light on motivation. There were references to something Emma needed to do, some plan that required her to be in Austin. But the specifics were always vague. Then David found the video footage from his hidden camera, and everything became horrifyingly clear. It was from a night 2 weeks ago. Emma was in his bed, pretending to be Sarah, but after David had fallen asleep, she'd gotten up and gone to his home office. The camera caught her sitting at his computer, typing furiously. David recognized the screen. She was accessing his work files, downloading proprietary code from his company's servers. Emma was committing corporate espionage, and Sarah was helping her do it by providing access through their marriage. David felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. His wife hadn't just betrayed him emotionally by letting her sister impersonate her. She'd used him, used their marriage, to steal from his company. Emma was probably selling the information to competitors, and Sarah was getting a cut. But there was something else in the messages that made David's blood run cold. There were conversations between Emma and someone named Marcus. a man who Emma referred to as her boyfriend. The messages were intimate, affectionate. Emma talked about how much she missed him, how she couldn't wait to be done with this job so they could be together. And then David found messages where Emma talked about him. About David. She told Marcus that the assignment was getting complicated because she was starting to enjoy the time with David. That he was different from what Sarah had described. Kinder, more attentive. She said she felt guilty about deceiving him. Marcus had replied telling her not to get emotional, to remember this was just a job. Emma had agreed, but her subsequent messages suggested her feelings were becoming a problem. She talked about how David made her laugh, how he listened when she talked, how being with him felt different than being with anyone else. David read those messages over and over, a sick feeling growing in his stomach. Emma was falling for him, and God help him, he realized he'd been falling for her too. All those inconsistencies he'd noticed, all those moments when Sarah seemed like a different person, those had been Emma. And he'd liked those moments. He'd liked the woman he thought was his wife, but was actually her twin sister. It was twisted and wrong and completely insane. But it was true. David made a decision. He wasn't going to confront them directly. That would just give them a chance to cover their tracks or flee. Instead, he was going to do what he did best. He was going to plan, prepare, and execute a solution with the same methodical approach he used for complex code. First, he contacted his company's security team and his manager. He explained that he'd discovered a breach of their systems through his home computer. He provided evidence of the downloads, carefully edited to remove any indication that he knew who was responsible. The company immediately launched an investigation and locked down the affected files. Then David contacted a divorce attorney, the same type of shark who'd handle complex fraud cases. He provided all the evidence he'd gathered, the plane tickets, the text messages, the video footage of Emma accessing his computer. The attorney's eyes widened as she reviewed everything. She told David this was one of the most elaborate cases of fraud she'd ever seen. They could go after Sarah for identity fraud, theft, conspiracy to commit corporate espionage, and about a dozen other charges. Emma could be charged with the same, plus impersonation and potentially more. If they played this right, both women would be facing serious jail time. But David had a different idea. He didn't want them in jail. He wanted something more personal. He asked his attorney to draw up divorce papers with specific terms. Sarah would get nothing. No alimony, no assets, no claim to their home or savings. Everything they'd built together would stay with David. Additionally, Sarah would be required to pay restitution for the theft of intellectual property, even though the theft was technically committed by Emma. As for Emma, David was going to sue her personally for fraud, emotional distress, and theft. He was going after every penny she had. But that wasn't all. David had another plan, one that his attorney said was unethical, but not technically illegal. He was going to expose them both in the most public way possible. David waited until both twins were in town. He knew from their text messages that they were planning another switch in 3 days. Sarah was going to fly to Denver and Emma was going to take her place for a week. It was the perfect opportunity. David invited both families, his parents and Sarah's parents, to their home for a dinner party to celebrate their upcoming anniversary. Sarah was confused by the sudden gesture, but agreed. What she didn't know was that David had also invited Emma, telling her separately that Sarah wanted her there as a surprise. The night of the dinner party arrived. Sarah was there, playing the role of loving wife. Emma showed up as expected, pretending she'd flown in just for the occasion. David's parents were delighted to see everyone. Sarah's parents were pleased to have both their daughters in the same room for once. David waited until everyone was seated at the dinner table. Then he stood up, tapping his wine glass to get everyone's attention. He said he wanted to make a toast and share some exciting news. Everyone looked at him expectantly. Sarah smiled, probably thinking he was going to say something sweet about their anniversary. Emma's smile was more nervous. David pulled out a folder and opened it on the table. Inside were printed copies of all the evidence, the plane tickets, the text messages, the still frames from the video showing Emma at his computer. He laid them out one by one, explaining in a calm, measured voice exactly what Sarah and Emma had been doing for the past 6 months. The room went silent. Sarah's face drained of color. Emma looked like she might be sick. Their parents stared at the evidence, then at their daughters, confusion and horror dawning on their faces. David's mother asked if this was some kind of joke. David assured her it wasn't. He explained how the twins had been switching places, how Emma had been impersonating Sarah, how they'd used his access to commit corporate espionage. He showed them the messages where Emma talked about her feelings for him, the twisted triangle that had developed. Sarah tried to defend herself, stammering that David didn't understand, that it wasn't what it looked like. But her father cut her off, his voice shaking with rage. He demanded to know if what David was saying was true. Sarah broke down in tears. Emma sat frozen, unable to speak. Their mother started crying. David's parents looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and shock. David continued. He announced that he'd filed for divorce and that Sarah would be receiving the papers officially tomorrow. He was also suing Emma for fraud and theft. Both women would be hearing from his attorney. He suggested that they might want to hire good lawyers because his company's security team was also pursuing criminal charges for the corporate espionage. Sarah's father stood up, face red with anger. He looked at his daughters and told them they'd brought shame on the family. He demanded to know whose idea it had been. Sarah and Emma looked at each other, and in that moment, David saw the lifetime of conspiracy between them. They'd always been in sync, always backed each other up. Even now, facing complete ruin, they were united. Emma finally spoke. She admitted it was her idea. She said she'd gotten involved with the wrong people, owed money she couldn't pay, and they'd threatened her. The corporate espionage was supposed to be her way out. She'd convinced Sarah to help her, promising it would be just once. But once had turned into twice, and twice had turned into months of deception. She looked at David, tears streaming down her face. She told him she never meant for any of this to happen, that she'd started to care about him, that the time they'd spent together had been real to her, even if it was built on lies. David stared at her, feeling nothing. He told her that whatever she felt didn't matter. She'd used him, manipulated him, and violated his trust in the worst way possible. Sarah had done the same. They'd both treated him like a tool, a means to an end. The dinner party ended in chaos. Sarah's parents left with their daughters, probably to figure out damage control. David's parents stayed behind, trying to make sense of what they'd just witnessed. His mother hugged him, telling him she was sorry. His father asked what David needed, ready to support him however necessary. David told them he just needed them to leave. He wanted to be alone. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and brutal. Sarah signed the divorce papers without contest, probably advised by her lawyer that fighting would only make things worse. The settlement gave David everything: the house, the savings, the car. Sarah walked away with nothing but her clothes and whatever she'd managed to hide in separate accounts. Emma was hit even harder. The lawsuit against her resulted in a judgment that would take her years to pay off. David's company pressed charges, and while Emma ultimately avoided jail time through a plea deal, she was left with a criminal record and ruined reputation. Her graphic design career evaporated as word spread about what she'd done. The story made local news. Twin sisters caught in elaborate deception and corporate espionage scheme. The headlines were sensational, and David found himself fielding calls from reporters wanting more details. He declined all interviews, letting the court documents speak for themselves. Sarah moved back in with their parents, broke and unemployed. Most companies wouldn't touch her once they learned about the scandal. Emma moved to a different state, trying to start over somewhere people didn't know her name. As for David, he threw himself into work. The company promoted him, partially as compensation for what he'd been through. He moved to a different house, unable to stay in the place where so much deception had occurred. He dated occasionally, but found it hard to trust anyone. The thing that haunted him most wasn't the betrayal itself, though that was painful enough. It was the realization that he'd fallen in love with Emma during those 6 months. The woman he'd thought was his wife becoming a better version of herself had actually been a completely different person. And some part of him had responded to that, had felt things he hadn't felt for Sarah in years. It made him question everything about his marriage. Had he ever really known Sarah? Had their relationship been real, or had it always been some kind of performance? The lines between truth and deception had become so blurred that he couldn't tell anymore. About a year after the divorce, David received an unexpected letter. It was from Emma, postmarked from somewhere in Oregon. He almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of him. The letter was an apology, though David wasn't sure how much it was worth. Emma wrote that she'd been in therapy, trying to understand why she'd done what she did. She acknowledged that she'd hurt him in ways that couldn't be fixed. She said she'd been selfish and cruel, that there was no excuse for her actions, but she also wrote something that made David pause. She said the time they'd spent together, even though it was built on deception, had been some of the happiest moments of her life. That David had shown her what it was like to be with someone who actually cared. That she'd sabotaged it because she didn't believe she deserved it. She ended the letter by saying she didn't expect forgiveness. She just wanted him to know that he'd changed her, made her want to be a better person, even if it was too late. David read the letter twice, then put it in a drawer. He didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. 2 years after everything fell apart, David started dating again. He met a woman named Lisa through friends, someone with no connection to his past. She was kind and honest, and everything Emma had pretended to be. They took things slowly, building trust brick by brick. Sometimes David would catch himself looking at Lisa, searching for signs of deception, checking that her scars stayed in the same place, that her preferences remained consistent, that she was who she claimed to be. It was exhausting and unfair to her, but he couldn't help it. Lisa noticed, of course. One evening she asked him directly if he was ever going to trust her. David realized he had to make a choice. He could let what Sarah and Emma did to him define the rest of his life, or he could try to move forward. He chose to move forward. It wasn't easy. Trust didn't come naturally anymore. But he worked at it, bit by bit, day by day. As for Sarah and Emma, David heard through mutual acquaintances that they'd had a falling out. The sisters who'd been so united in their deception couldn't survive the aftermath. They blamed each other for the disaster their lives had become. Last David heard, they weren't speaking. There was a certain justice in that. They'd conspired together and destroyed together. It seemed fitting that they'd end up alone. David Chen had been a man who valued consistency and routine. Sarah and Emma had shattered that world, teaching him that people weren't always who they seemed, that even the most intimate relationships could be built on lies. The lesson had cost him everything, but it had also freed him in an unexpected way. He'd learned that he could survive betrayal, that he could rebuild, that the revenge he'd exacted, public and total, had given him closure even if it hadn't given him peace. Sometimes, late at night, David would think about those 6 months, about the moments with Emma that had felt so real, about the version of his wife who'd seemed happier and more engaged, about the twisted triangle that had formed between 3 people, only one of whom understood what was really happening. It was a story he'd never fully understand, a deception so elaborate it bordered on madness. But it was his story, and he'd survived it. That had to count for something. David Richardson had loved one woman and been betrayed by 2. His revenge had destroyed them both, and while that should have felt like victory, mostly it just felt like survival. But survival was enough. It had to be.